What happens when one side brings overwhelming hardware, 180 drones, 120 tanks, and an army of elite infantry, and the other side brings patience, preparation, and terrain traps? On August 12, 2025, Ukraine answered that question. Instead of a decisive breakthrough, Russia found itself funneled into kill zones that transformed farmland into fiery steel graveyards. But what exact moves turned brute force into broken momentum? This video shows the precise steps that reshaped the battlefield and left Russia staggering before breakfast. Before we move on, I would like you to subscribe to the channel and like the video. How could 11 tanks, the heaviest armored war machines in Russia's arsenal, simply vanish in just 6 minutes of combat? This was not a battlefield accident, nor was it the result of some sudden weather shift obscuring the fight. It was deliberate, engineered, and planned for weeks by Ukrainian commanders, who shaped farmland as carefully as a carpenter shapes wood. The outcome was not a clash between raw strength and weakness, but between expectation and preparation. Russia came forward with weight, and Ukraine answered with patience hidden in dirt. Russia opened this operation with a three-pronged assault, pressing armor columns, low-flying drones, and elite infantry, meant to punch through weak points. On paper, it looked like a hammer blow. The first line of drones hovered over fields at dawn, feeding live coordinates to tank crews rolling in behind them. Infantry followed close, holding positions in open carriers designed to pile forward into gaps. Each piece of this machine had one purpose: soften, break, and push until defenders buckled. The plan appeared overwhelming, but the ground itself did not agree. Unknown to Russian scout, every field along that axis was prepared far in advance. Ukraine's engineers had been out weeks before, digging, layering, and concealing. Shallow ditches were widened into tank traps, then camouflaged so they looked like untouched farmland. Wooden stakes, topped with rebar, were buried under thin soil, waiting to rip through treads. Mine chains lay under wheat fields, in carefully mapped patterns. Even the mud in marshy areas was tested and measured, recorded on charts, so artillery units knew where the enemy would be forced to funnel once things went wrong. This was not terrain anymore. It was a weapon. The moment Russian tanks advanced, the trap came alive. The lead vehicles pushed forward with confidence, their turrets blazing, while drone operators radioed positions. They had no signal of danger until the first tank ground to a halt, its wheels shredded against hidden steel spikes. Seconds later, another veered into what it thought was solid ground, only to crash nose first into a shallow pit, tilting helplessly while its engine roared. Mines detonated in sequence under the next set. One, then another, then four, almost at once. Their crews had no time for warning. The shockwaves were visible in drone footage, metal burning, hatches flying open, men scrambling into fields that were themselves seeded with explosives. Russian operators watching from command stations felt it too. Their own unmanned aircraft, hovering for surveillance, captured the obliteration in real time. What was meant to be a proud moment of momentum was instead horror on their own screens. Soldiers saw comrades not advancing but scattering, lost in smoke and fire. Infantry carriers pulled off course, unsure of where safe ground existed, and every hesitation became a target for Ukrainian artillery zeroed in days earlier, waiting for stalled armor columns to present a wall of heat signatures. By the 6-minute mark, 11 tanks no longer existed as combat machines. They were fireballs, carcasses of steel scattered across rows of dead farmland. Instead of pressing forward, infantry units crouched for cover. Commanders spat orders into radios demanding alternatives, and every path forward looked lethal. Panic spread in the vanguard, confusion mounted, and what began as a staged breakthrough dissolved into chaos. Why did Russia's infiltration squads, specially trained to slip through gaps and restore order, end up hunted like prey before sunrise? Their mission was not a reckless gamble. These were disciplined units tasked with striking from behind to cut Ukrainian communication lines and force defenders to scatter. Instead of chaos in Ukrainian ranks, though, the covert squads found themselves tracked, mapped, and destroyed before most even realized they had been spotted. By the time daylight touched the fields near Novopavlivka, The very forces meant to rescue Russia's offensive were fleeing or dead, surrounded by smoke, shellfire, and drone buzz overhead. With the front line crushed by immobilized armor, Russian command turned to infiltration as a last lever. These squads were ordered forward after darkness, in groups of 8 to 12, moving on foot, across wreckage and along hedgerows. They avoided main roads, took shelter in barns and tool sheds, and even hid in ditches under discarded farm equipment. Each squad carried silenced weapons, grenades, and small drones meant for short-range reconnaissance. Their goal was simple: survive until daylight and then strike Ukrainian gunners and artillery teams from the rear. The plan required stealth, patience, and the assumption that Ukraine's focus would remain on visible columns. That assumption was wrong. Drones above the battlefield did not go idle after tanks burned. Ukrainian operators switched infrared systems to full scan, searching for stray heat sources in outbuildings, clumps of trees, and even haystacks that radiated uneven signatures. The technology left little guesswork. A warm silhouette under a roofless shed, or a cluster of figures huddled in a trench jumped out on screens. Once tagged, those signatures were marked for either mortar fire or motorcycle pursuit squads that now began flooding into the field. The balance had shifted again. Russian squads were not predators in the dark. They were glowing targets. Ukrainian counter units rode on stripped-down motorcycles, light enough to dart along broken terrain without stalling, yet fast enough to reach 70 miles per hour when roads allowed. Each carried 2 or 3 men, one driving while the others handled rifles or grenade launchers. They moved in swarms, fanning out toward identified hotspots before infiltrators had time to reposition. These motorcycle groups were not operating blind. They were in constant contact with artillery officers, fed live coordinates by drones. When they closed on a suspected Russian hideout, mortars fell within meters, exploding just ahead to pin squads in place. The motorcycles then swept around the craters, cutting off retreat routes. The pace of these engagements was violent and short. In Novopavlovka alone, 11 infiltration teams were wiped out in less than 20 minutes. Shelters turned into fire traps as shells detonated overhead. Men forced from hiding crawled across churned earth, only to meet small arms fire from fast-moving bikes weaving past. Those few who tried slipping back toward their own lines found pathways sealed by deliberate artillery barrages. By 7:20 a.m., hundreds of Russian troops who had been held in reserve were suddenly trapped in a shrinking pocket between smoldering farm plots. Escape corridors disappeared under smoke clouds and collapsing buildings. At 7:45, the picture was undeniable. More than 1,000 Russian casualties were recorded alongside dozens of obliterated vehicles, with camouflaged ditches now clogged by twisted steel. What began as an armored onslaught collapsed into a graveyard of machinery and infantry in just 85 minutes of combat. The strike that was supposed to restore momentum instead dismantled any chance of recovery. Ukraine had turned retreat into pursuit, and pursuit into annihilation. But beyond a battlefield littered with burned armor and shattered squads, there lingered a deeper question. What did this sudden collapse mean for Russia's wider strategy, its politics back home, and the watching world, now measuring its strength by the wreckage left behind? Brute force did not fail because it lacked equipment. It failed because acres of ground had been reshaped into weapons long before tanks arrived. Precision, patience, and quiet calculation turned farmland into death traps that erased Russia's numerical edge. The losses carried another message. Ukraine spent about $20 million preparing those traps, yet dismantled an assault worth 30 times more. That gap reveals the power of design over volume, of strategy over weight. So the question is yours. When war leans on brains instead of brawn, will tomorrow's victories belong to whoever strikes hardest or whoever builds the smarter trap?